The maids gathered in the posh mansion and speculated about why so many people had gathered today and why everyone around them was so worried. They assumed that they had guests arriving, but the second girl whispered conspiratorially that it was Raiden who had arrived. All the girls were very unhappy that once again this horrible man had arrived, as he would once again want to propose to their mistress. One maid said grudgingly that it was probably because the bastard had stolen all their earl's property, but everyone had known about it for a long time, and they also knew that he was using it to force their lady to marry him. They were very sorry to their mistress that she had to do business with this horrible man. They hoped that she would not have to marry her own cousin after all. While in the room, the protagonist was talking to her cousin, who informed her that she should be aware of what he had come for, and afterward informed her that if she married him, he would allow her to live a lifetime of prosperity, and afterward he informed her with a gloating smile on his face that he would be her first. But the girl gave him her cold stare carefully and informed him that she was declining his offer. He clenched his hand into a fist and said that she should be grateful that he wanted to marry her. After all, if she refused him, she would be lonely and unneeded for the rest of her life. But despite his refusals, the protagonist constantly continues to flirt with him, as he believes, and in every way to seduce him. The girl didn't look at him anymore. She looked at her cup of tea and thought about the fact that she had never heard a worse marriage proposal in her life. Hedel, looking at her interlocutor, mentally asked herself to be quiet, as it wasn't worth her nerves and worries. So just ignoring Raiden would be the easiest thing to do. Raiden always dreamed of revenge because of his father, who did not receive the title and family property because of the order of inheritance. Then he thought and came up with a plan, which he decided to put into practice. Thanks to this plan, Raiden stole the property of the current count. Raven has always been an arrogant and hypocritical young man, so such meanness on his part was not surprising. He scrutinized the protagonist and told her that he would give her some more time to think and she should accept his proposals, because for her family, their engagement would be more important than her personal opinion. But afterwards he approached the main character and said that, however, her opinion doesn't matter much because anyway, in the end she will marry him anyway, whether the girl wants it or not. Nervously clutched the hem of her dress, but made no reply. Then the man said he no longer wished to remain on their estate and left. The protagonist, the daughter of an earl, so she always knew she would have to get married someday, but she was very frightened by the very thought that she might marry the man who took everything her family had. She didn't understand why she should marry such a horrible man, and as she watched Raiden's carriage drive away, she thought it would be better to die than to live like this. Her father slammed his fist angrily on the table and asked how a bastard like this Raiden dared to propose to her. The protagonist's brother took her by the shoulders and told Hedel not to worry, and if suddenly it happens again, he will come to him personally and refuse his offer. The father asked Cedric if there were more effective methods, but he looked at his father carefully and calmly explained that they should talk first, and if that didn't work, they would find another and perhaps even harsher way to subdue him. The main character saw two young men arguing and suggested that they calm down while they worked out a plan to go to his place right now and deal with Raiden man to man. The girl reflected that her father and brother would not soon settle down after all that happened in their house. The protagonist knew that they loved her very much, and the girl also realized that it was best to end it. But she realized that Raiden would definitely take revenge if she refused to marry him. Hedel looked sadly at the lingering sky outside the window, which was flooded with lightning, and reflected that under no circumstances did she want to marry such a terrible man as her cousin. But she doesn't have any good reason not to. And if her family didn't owe him money, she wouldn't have to do it. So Hedel smiled sweetly and turned to her father and brother. She asked them to let her deal with Reed so they wouldn't have to worry so much. But suddenly they were brought out of their conversation by a servant who came panting before them and announced that Duke Raiden had arrived again. Then the father couldn't stand it any longer and started cursing at this freak, who again decided to disturb them twice in one day, and told his son that this time they should take him in properly. The girl tried to stop her father, but she couldn't because he was too determined. She looked at the two hostile men in shock and didn't understand why Raiden had decided to come now. It started raining very hard outside, which didn't seem to stop. Then Raiden, shaking his coat off the water, began to complain about having to come all the way out here again to get the cherished consent, and then resented being made to run back and forth like a sheep. And all he wants is consent. But the protagonist's cousin was sure that he was a very good and kind young man, so be it, he's even ready to ask again politely. But suddenly he was brought out of his musings by the voice of the protagonist's father, who called him by name. Raiden turned around unhappily, wondering who even dared to shout his name so viciously. But the next moment he was grabbed by a strong male hand by his clothes. His father angrily bent over him and looking into his frightened eyes asked, "Is such a pathetic puppy as this fellow going to marry his daughter?" He only smiled grudgingly and said that it was wrong to greet his future son-in-law in such a way, and then asked him if he had forgotten that he would soon be Hedel's husband. The girl at this time was standing near the window, behind which lightning flashed brightly, as if to curse everything that was happening. Her father informed Raiden that he could never become her husband, as he would not allow such a terrible man to marry his precious and only daughter. But Raiden grudgingly informed the Count not to go too far, as he doubted that anyone in this world but himself would want to marry his nobody's daughter. So the protagonist's father should be grateful to him for having the magnanimity to propose marriage for his daughter. This all stood and listened in horror to Hedel, who did not know what to answer. But it didn't need to, because in the next moment, Raiden's face was covered in redness from the blow. Her obviously aggressive brother, who was ready to kill the guy on the spot, warned that if Toth dared to insult his sister again, Raiden Argent wouldn't get off with one punch. He fell to the floor and started screaming like a hurt little child, asking how a freak like her older brother dared to hit him. He stood up and reached for Cedric's coat collar and started calling him names, but at that moment the main character ran out and yelled for everyone to stop. As she ran in terror, the girl realized that the situation was out of control and at this rate someone could get hurt. She didn't know what she should do or how to make them all stop. But suddenly, as she was running down the stairs, she was called by the maid, who informed her that a guest had arrived. She looked in surprise at the man who had entered. He took off his hat and apologized for arriving so unexpectedly, and then said he would like to meet Lady Hedel Argenta. The girl, looking at him excitedly, informed him that she was Hedel, and then inquired what had happened. The man bowed, apologizing for the late visit, and then introduced himself. It was Gilliam Oswell. He was the Duke of Eckert's butler. He said that the Duke had intended to visit her personally, but unfortunately he had some urgent business to attend to, so the butler had to replace him. The girl watched in shock and didn't understand why Duke Eckert was looking for her and what had even happened. But she had no time to ask the question before the man held out a scroll and informed her that it was a letter the Duke was addressing to her. And then in the presence of her older brother, her father, and Raiden himself, he began to read it out. The letter read, "Dear Lady Argenta, please accept my proposal of engagement." The girl listened in shock, not understanding why the suddenness of it. The girl reflected that Duke Eckert's butler had suddenly arrived at their door, and he had come in a fine gilded carriage and also brought with him a shining box which concealed a marvelous necklace of moonstone encrusted with diamonds. This jewel alone would be enough to last her the rest of her life. Besides, the butler gave her this gift in honor of her engagement proposal. As the butler read out the letter, Cedric and his father snarked about how this all came to be, and why so suddenly the Duke was offering their daughter's hand and heart. At this time, Raiden grudgingly remarked that the girl was some skillful schemer who had managed to sneak off to the east and pick up a duke. Cedric was insanely displeased and wanted to do something about it already, but he was suddenly stopped by the butler's hand, who looked angrily at the insolent Raiden and asked if he was ready to take responsibility for such words, and then explained, saying that he should be held accountable for such an insult to the Lady Argenta and Duke Eckert. When he saw the serious look on Gilliam's face, he hesitated. He was obviously scared and didn't know what to say. Then he asked in surprise what kind of insult he was talking about. And after turning around, he started to run away quickly and thought that he didn't need such a wedding. So he called the crew and finally left her house. The girl, who had been steadily watching her fleeing cousin, was distracted when she was called by the butler Gilliam. He informed Lady Argenta that she did not have to answer him immediately, as he would be staying in the capital awaiting her reply. So when she had made up her mind, he would be entirely at her service. Afterward, he bowed politely to her and said goodbye. After he left, the girl had a serious talk with Cedric and her father. Both questioned her if she had ever met Duke Eckert, but she reported that she had never even seen him before. Her father wondered how it was possible that they had never crossed paths, but the girl understood why her father was so excited. The last Duke Eckert was famous throughout the empire. They say his family held part of the imperial treasury and owned the eastern part of the empire, but after the death of the Duke and Duchess, the title passed to their young son, the current Duke of the Eckert family. He has never left the eastern part of the empire, and he is extremely secretive, as he is hardly ever seen in public or in political circles. Girls from all over the empire were discussing the fact that the new duke, that is, the son of the now deceased Duke Eckert, who took over the title, is actually very ugly. And she was told that he was a real monster. So with the arrival of the new duke in possession, the glory of his duchy gradually faded away, leaving behind it only strange rumors. Cedric carefully reread the letter sent by Duke Eckert and didn't understand why he suddenly decided to marry her. Then my father said he was against the marriage because he had heard that Eckert was not a very kind man, and Cedric added that the East is close to the outside world and the people there are strange, so he's afraid to let her go there alone. He doesn't know if the girl will like it there. Then the father said that it all looked very strange indeed, as they don't know what kind of man this Duke is and whether the protagonist will be happily married to him. But the girl looked at them confidently and told them that the biggest problem right now was Raiden, who was terrorizing her daily with marriage requests. She confidently informed the two that she would never allow her family to be mocked, so she needs a good reason to reject him for good. And she herself doesn't know why the Duke needs her, but it's the perfect opportunity to refuse Raiden, so she decided to accept Duke Eckhart's offer. Suddenly, the father shouted a protest and said they are not going to sell their favorite daughter to the Duke for the good of their family. And the brother said that he completely agrees with their father and Hidel shouldn't have to do this because of them. Because in time they will be able to pay off all their debts to him, so she doesn't have to sacrifice herself and should only marry the man she truly loves. The girl realized that no matter how much they said or how sincere they were, it was the only reliable way to save her and her family. And she could no longer live in the same luxury as before. Plus, Hidel had to constantly fight with Reed over their debts. The girl, turning to her father and her brother, said that they shouldn't blame themselves and she really was fine, especially since the Duke wasn't such a bad man. Her father hugged his daughter gently and then told her that she needed to think about it. She agreed, but in fact, she had already thought about it and her father knew that she could not change her mind. So a month later, she called at the Earl of Argenta's estate, her father, the butler Gilliam. He bowed and said he was honored to see Lady Hidel again. He said that the Duke apologized that he could not be present, so the butler would be at her service in his place. The girl said she'd like to talk to him more about their wedding. Then Gilliam informed her that the Duke would take care of all the wedding expenses and also that the Lord required no devotion from her family. And besides, he promised that he would pay all the debts of the Earl. The girl smiled brightly at the butler and said that the last point would be unnecessary. After all, if the Duke does so, everyone will think that the family sold her because of the debts. So she is against this decision and asked to take her opinion into account. With a smile, Gilliam informed her that it was a very doable request and asked if she had any other questions. Then the girl, looking at him, carefully asked if she could know the reason why Duke Eckert had chosen her. But Gilliam only said that, unfortunately for her, he had no such information, and then he said that if the girl had asked everything she wanted to know, he should leave. Hidel thanked him for coming and helping her sort some things out. Before leaving, the butler said that if the Lady Argenta was concerned about the young man who had offered her his engagement, he could deal with him. However, the girl, carefully looking at the man, informed him that he need not worry about it, as she would accept Duke Eckert's offer and then any other problems would solve themselves. So a few more days passed and the servants of their house packed everything they needed into the carriage. They were worried that they might have forgotten something and put even Lady Argenta's favorite cup. Hidel was already standing and saying goodbye to her brother and father. They were very worried about her and asked that they be careful on the road and to dress warmer, for the cold weather in the east was severe, much more so than in the south. To smiled the warmest smile at them and informed them that she would watch herself. Cedric turned to her and sadly looked at his sister and told her that if anything went wrong or the Duke treated her badly, she should return at any time. After all, they would not leave her, but the girl assured him that everything would be all right and it wouldn't happen, and then asked them to remember to eat well while she was away. Then the girl turned to her personal maid and asked if she was ready to go, for they had to leave soon, but she assured her that everything was all right. So the girl got into the carriage and said goodbye to her relatives and wished them well, and afterward the carriage set off. In the carriage, Jenny wondered what would happen if her husband turned out to be a horrible person, or if the description of his appearance was true. But the girl looked her over carefully with her green eyes and informed her that it was all just a bad rumor and she shouldn't worry. Of course, she didn't know the Eastern lands and the identity of the Duke, but she was sure that everything would be fine. And also the protagonist knew that she had to protect her loved ones. Of course, soon the girl's carriage left the capital, the place where she had lived all her life, and after a month and a half, they finally arrived. Girl, pushing back her curtains, surveyed the Eastern Duchy of Eckhart. Jenny was thrilled that they had finally passed the Eastern Gate, and the protagonist, looking around at everything, thought about the fact that the fog was so thick in these lands that it was almost impossible to distinguish anything. Then Jenny excitedly asked if they would arrive at the place itself today, but the protagonist assured her that today should be their last stop, so they should arrive before tonight. Jenny smiled awkwardly and embarrassedly, admitting that she was madly worried, for this would be her first time in east of their empire, and then her attention was caught by the beautiful city that was flooding with sunshine. It didn't go unnoticed by the protagonist, and she too swept up that today's weather is incredibly breezy. Jenny said that Mistress will have to dress much warmer now, for the cold weather is very severe in the east. But the girl stared mesmerized at the window and didn't understand what had happened and why people were so happy and as if they were celebrating something. Finally, when they were approaching the manor, Jenny asked Mrs. Heddle if she could comb her hair, as they were about to arrive at the manor itself. But the girl was still fascinated by the people who looked very happy, but she was taken out of her thoughts by the voice of the coachman, who informed Lady Argent that they were almost there. The girl thought that soon she would have to meet the Duke. She looked around the estate and realized that this was where her new life would begin. Eckerd Manor would be her home. The girl, shading her eyes with her hand to look around the house, noticed that the sun was very bright today. But then she saw the smiling face of the butler, who looked up at the sky and informed her that apparently the sun was also very happy to meet her today. Then the girl turned to Gilliam and said that when they were traveling, the main character noticed something very strange and explained that in the morning everyone was dancing and shouting very joyfully. And afterwards she asked if people were so happy about the sunrise. The butler, leaning over to her, said that everyone was so happy because bright sunshine in the east was extremely rare, and afterward respectfully informed her that, if Heddle would permit me to add, he himself had seen the dawn in these lands for the first time in a long time. The girl reflected that the capital city in which she lived had always been so beautiful. She had never thought that people would be so glad to see the dawn, for she considered a proper thing, which to other people was an incredible miracle. Eventually the doors opened in front of her and the girl was faced by maids and guards, who said hello to the arriving mistress. One of the girls came up to her and said she would help her with the main character's luggage. She thanked her profusely for it. She thanked her sincerely and said that she would like to meet the Duke, so she asked him to tell her where he was. She wondered if she was relieved that Duke Eckerd was not home yet, but upon reflection, she realized that she was not. In fact, she wasn't relieved at all, but she decided that while he was away, she needed to get used to the place first, and try to find some pros, because there probably are some. She looked around at the withered plants in the garden, and afterward the uninhabited rooms where the web hung, and found that no matter how hard she tried, the girl could find no major plus. The main character was simply horrified by the fact that she did not find even the slightest plus. The girl already realized that everything in this mansion will have to be repaired, and it is better to break everything and build again. Then she thought about the fact that she already very much wants to return to her home. But suddenly she was addressed by Gilliam, who called to the Lady Argenta and asked her to treat her to tea before he showed her to her room. Eventually they got together for a cup of tea, and the girl sipped it and realized that the taste was quite different from any other tea she had drunk before. Then the butler said that he had invited her to discuss something, and in fact he just wanted to tell her some peculiarities of life in the East. The girl looked at him excitedly and wondered what he meant. When the butler saw her concerned look, he immediately informed her that he recommended that she take at least 5 guards when she went outside the manor, as the East was known for crime and it wasn't as safe as the capital. And even the Duke himself had to think about it. Also, she should not go about the grounds at night, as it is dangerous, and it is safest to stay in the room. Heddle realized that the reason for this was the low pay of the clerks. Because of this, not many guards were posted. Gilliam went on to say that, as he had said earlier, sunny weather is a rarity here, and usually every day there is dense fog or heavy rains that flood parts of the city. The girl opened her mouth in shock, not realizing just how much it could rain here. The Duke saw the frightened face and said, waving his hands, that she was safe inside the manor, for it was built on a hill, so there was no danger of floods, and afterward he added that his lordship the Duke, owing to his business, was seldom at home. Then the protagonist thought that apparently for this reason many people tend to go to the East to earn money, and then she, with all the care she could muster in studying Gilliam's face, inquired if she could meet his lordship. To this the butler gave her his consent and assured her that their meeting would certainly take place. As Heddle walked to her room, she reflected that the Duke was still quite a mysterious figure to her. He doesn't run the estate directly, which is why it's so neglected. And yet her room had been done up very tenderly and with care. The butler, who was escorting the protagonist, said that he was sorry that the estate had so many faults and explained that the reason was that it was very difficult to make repairs because of the climate. In addition, his lordship pays very little attention to the care of the house. So Heddle was left alone in her room. She thought that it would be nice if the ruined garden of the manor were as well looked after as her private room. And afterward, she lay on her bed and thought that perhaps they could see her spouse during dinner. She fell asleep like that, but suddenly woke up in the middle of the night, not realizing what time it was. She was worried that she had fallen asleep for so long and ended up missing dinner. The girl heard quiet footsteps across the room and began to look around. She wondered who had come to see her, but as the comer did not answer her question, she quickly reached out with her hand and picked up a candlestick with which, in case of emergency, she could defend herself. And then holding up her weapon said that if he didn't answer her question, the girl would start screaming. Then the man who remained in the shadows apologized for waking her. The girl immediately realized that Gilliam had already told her that the safest place to be was in her own room, so if someone was coming to see her at this hour, it was most likely his lordship. So the girl asked if her hunch was true. She saw that the silhouette of a tall and sturdy man stood out clearly in the dim moonlight. He confirmed her guess as the girl and said she was very pleased to meet him, and then introduced herself, but she wondered why he was still hiding in the dark. She informed him that this room was very dark and asked if he would mind if she blew out the candles, since she could barely see anything, but the man replied one-wordedly that it was unfortunately not possible now. The girl thought sadly that perhaps he really could be that unattractive, but agreed nonetheless. Sitting down on the edge of Thebed, she asked if they could talk through a few questions, and the first one she asked was why he wanted to marry her. The man gave her an attentive look, but didn't answer anything. Then the girl didn't realize what had happened, because she didn't tell him she didn't want to do it. She just wanted to know why. Hedel didn't like that, so she informed him that she couldn't see his face as it was, and also she wasn't allowed to know the answers to her questions. So she asked him to answer at least something. Rising from her seat, she inquired if she could expect to be treated well. Then Duke Eckerd, still in the shadows, said she would be treated appropriately. Then the girl was already starting to get angry and asked what power the Duchess had in these lands, but the latter calmly explained that more power than she would wield in the East would be wielded only by him. Then Hedel, confidently looking at his silhouette, said that she was going to renovate this building, and since she was going to live in this estate in the future, she wanted to personally furnish it. She was very angry at his strange manners and the fact that he was so short-tempered. He agreed with her and informed her that it was time for him to leave. The girl was angry at such a strong reluctance on the part of Duke Eckerd to talk to his own future wife. But in the end, the doors slammed shut and the protagonist was left alone with her own thoughts. She had absolutely no idea why the man had asked her to get engaged, but she knew she should keep a positive attitude. At least she would have enough influence, and she should start with transforming the garden. She lit a candle that illuminated some part of the room, and then excitedly noticed that someone unknown had brought her soup. The protagonist was surprised and thought that maybe she hadn't heard her maid Jenna come in. Morning came, and the girl with full determination decided that in such weather it was possible to gather people to work, but suddenly her attention was attracted by something. On the floor lay a shiny scale. The girl, picking it up, did not understand how it could be here and suggested that perhaps the maid had not cleaned well. The girl decided to walk around the mansion and realized that even leaving out the problem with the garden, there was a lot of things in this estate that needed care and repair. After all, everything was in a rather poor state or had not been cleaned for a long time. Hedel wiped her finger clean of dust and admitted that there's a lot of work to be done, and she doesn't even know if it's good or bad. But suddenly my attention was attracted by the frightened maids, who were immediately frightened as soon as they saw her. The girl looked at them worriedly and thought that maybe they were avoiding her because she had noticed such behavior before. Though, since it was nice weather, she shouldn't think about such things. So she decided that she shouldn't worry about it. But something bad is bound to happen at times like this. She caught a picture of the maids who had previously worked at the mansion brutalizing her maid Jenna. The red-haired bitchy girl asked if she was going to defend a girl who'd been sold to a duke, and the other maid added that a lady who'd been kicked out of the capital to the Far East was worthless. Jenna cried and denied their words. Then one of them hit her with her finger and said that Jenny should know her place, for she was not at home, and if she thought that she came from the capital and that meant that she was worthy of anything, they were ready to prove the contrary and tell her what the rules were in the East. But suddenly they noticed that the main character was watching it all from the side, who looked at them angrily, with eyes full of contempt, and asked what had happened between them. They smiled pretentiously and assured him that nothing special had happened and that it was just a normal servant thing, so a lady like her shouldn't waste her time on them. Hedel had realized from the beginning that she shouldn't have counted on respect in these parts, but she hadn't expected it to come to this. So the girl evil glanced at her and asked, "Does what's going on really not demand her attention?" And then she took her maid by the hand and told her that Jenna was her personal maid who had come with her, and they had no right to treat her person like that. And afterwards she added that she really hoped it was the first and last time and that it wouldn't happen again. The girl remembered that before she left, her father had given her instructions that she should always be respectful of those people, but it did not mean that she should tolerate any insults. After all, she needed to respect others, but maintain her dignity. Clutching her skirt, Hedel thought she would do as her father had told her, and therefore she must not turn a blind eye to the insult. After the protagonist, with all the determination of the maid who had offended her, said that they should not forget that in the future she would become a duchess, and even now she had every right to reprimand them. So if she does something they don't like, those should say it to her face. and she will listen to each and every one of them with attention. After leaving, the protagonist took a handkerchief and gave it to her maid, and afterwards calmed her down and told her that everything would be fine in the future. She smiled brightly at her and informed her that she should definitely tell her if something like this happened in the future, and she would definitely help her, and afterwards sent Jenny off to rest today. She tried to argue since Mistress would be left alone with such people, but she said she had plans to start renovating the garden today. But suddenly she was brought out of her musings by Gilliam's approach. She smiled sincerely and said she was madly glad to see him at this hour. He put his hand to his breast and said that he too was very glad to meet Lady Argenta, and afterwards said that he had been looking for her, and added that it would be bad form to speak in the middle of the corridor, so he suggested that we go into the drawing room. The girl immediately tried to make conversation about the Duke, but the butler informed her that his lordship had left the manor early in the morning. So the girl, waiting for her tea to be poured, said she had a confession to make, and then told Gilliam that she had reprimanded their maids for insulting her maid. She wondered if she had gone too far, since she was only a guest in their house for the time being. The butler looked her over carefully and told her that she had done the right thing and that Heidel would soon be her mistress, so she had every right to reprimand them, and also informed that it was entirely his fault, for he should have spent more time with the servants, and informed them that unfortunately they did not yet have any code of etiquette for them. But from now on, if anything like that happened, she, as mistress, had every right to reprimand them. The girl reflected that she was still very lucky to have really nice people in this place, and then she took a little sip and made sure she didn't like it at all. But she didn't give any sign, and so, putting down the cup, turned to Gilliam. The protagonist said that she wanted to meet him in order to find out how the wedding ceremony would be conducted. But the man looked at her worriedly and informed her that one was not planned. The girl looked at him shocked and didn't understand what the reason was. Then Gilliam, looking carefully, explained that they only needed to sign a contract to get married, but there would be no wedding ceremony. The girl knew that in Burmese Empire, weddings were a special event, whether they were for common people or nobles. No matter how rich they were, everyone had a wedding ceremony. So a couple who didn't have a wedding ceremony weren't considered newlyweds. Hedel admitted to herself that she had expected to have a wedding ceremony herself, and she had agreed to be engaged to the Duke without having the slightest idea who he was. Also, she could refuse Raiden's offer of marriage, but even so, she hoped that she and the Duke could get along well. But the girl realized that there was no turning back, and she assumed that probably the Duke just didn't want to marry her, and it was also favorable to him because of his own goals. So when she went to the Gilliam, she asked her to bring her the contract. Looking at the document, she wondered if after the signature she would become a duchess. He said that the contract would take effect after the Duke's signature and after they sent it to the palace. The girl looked closely at the butler and signed, and afterward informed him that now that the matter was finished she would like to attend to their garden, and asked to call everyone aloud, and afterward added that the Duke had authorized her to do so last night. Then Gilliam wondered with surprise and a little worry, but trying not to give himself away. But the girl unemotionally reported that they had met, but that it was very dark, so that she could scarcely see him, and that the Duke had been rather speechless with her. Some time passed, and the butler, as promised, gathered all the servants who were standing in the corridor, worried and not understanding what was going on and why they had been gathered. Then Hedel came up and greeted them all. She said that she was the future Duchess of Eckerd, and now she was going to rebuild the whole garden. So she needed their help. The servants wondered what she meant and why she suddenly wanted to rearrange the garden. They also did not understand whether she was serious about it. Then one of the men hesitantly raised his hand and introduced himself, saying that he was the gardener of the estate. The girl awkwardly thought that even such a ruined garden had its own gardener, and that was quite good. Afterwards, she said she wanted to know who among those present would be willing to help her rebuild the garden. In the end, after a while, they all ended up outside, and the girl looked around at the work to be done, thinking that among all the servants, only 5 people had been called to help. One of the girls, looking around at the sunny weather and clear skies, reported that this was the second day of such good weather. Then the protagonist thought about the fact that Gilliam had also mentioned it yesterday and realized that apparently sunshine was very rare indeed in these parts. And after looking around the whole area, she found that it was all in disrepair, shriveled grass and the withered vines that coiled around the columns. The girl reported in dismay that today we had to get rid of the withered bushes by the weeds, and afterward rolled up her sleeves in order to get to work. One of the maids noticed this and wondered if she was going to work with them too. But Hedel awkwardly pointed out that if they worked together, they'd get it done much faster. So we all worked together. The girls helped get rid of the grass, and the men hauled the logs. Hedel decided to take a little break from her work. Hedel stretched and thought that luckily all the work was going smoothly, so they could take a little break. Then she turned to Jenny and asked her to tell everyone to take a short rest while the protagonist brought them food. Jenny, looking at her mistress worriedly, wondered if she should go get food herself, but she assured her that it was all right and that she wanted to memorize the way to the manor. Eventually, she found herself inside and walking in search of the kitchen, mentally admitting to herself that it was hard enough getting here. But suddenly the confident, strong figure of a man appeared behind her back. She turned around, and then she saw a man who asked in bewilderment what was going on and why she was here. Before this, the girl reflected, as she wandered, that in principle there are 3 things necessary in life for a man: clothing, a roof over his head, and food. She thought she might have imagined it, but was suddenly distracted by the cook's voice, which told her it was the same sandwiches he had told her about earlier. She looked at this not-so-attractive picture and wondered if it was edible at all, and then, trying to hide her bewilderment, thought that she would never eat such a thing. Then the main character Po asked if she could use the kitchen, as she wanted to make her favorite sandwiches. But the cook grudgingly remarked that she could at least try it first and say whether she liked it or not. Afterward, he reported that everyone around him was praising his cooking. However, the girl told him that she does not even doubt that it is very tasty. Just for now, she wants to taste more familiar food, and after the protagonist asked if she can do it, the cook looked at her unhappily but still agreed. As the girl wandered around the kitchen, she noticed that there was a lot of seafood, and the cook explained to her that traders rarely come to the east, so they mostly eat only local products, as there's a large river nearby, entering the ocean, and there is a lot of fish. The girl immediately realized that they were catching and eating her on their own, and so it seemed to her that that soup had quite a fishy flavor, and now it was obvious to her. Eventually, some time passed, and the protagonist finished cooking. Afterwards, she asked the cook if he wanted to try it. He scrutinized the prepared dishes and hesitated between curiosity and pride, but the girl informed him that she had made one extra and he could eat it. The dish looked truly appetizing and beautiful when the cook took a bite of it, he felt goosebumps all over his body. He moved closer to the protagonist and wondered how she was able to cook something so delicious, but simply asked if she knew any other recipes. She looked at the man who was so mesmerized by her dishes with surprise, and then she laughed embarrassedly and said that she had to go already, but if anything, she could briefly tell. Then the cook quickly ran to bring paper, as it all had to be written down. Ended up bringing the servants the sandwiches, and they all praised them very much, saying how delicious they were and claiming they had never had such delicious sandwiches in their entire lives. One of the girls informed us with a bright smile that food can be very satisfying and tasty if it has something other than fish in it. And Jenny, and the main character, while they were eating, offhandedly remarked that it seemed like these people had been trying to eat nothing but fish their whole lives. The main character agreed with her guess. She remembered the chef who was so pleased with her food, thought that even he liked her appetizer, and she was very happy about it. And afterward, she mentally promised that she would rid these people of the annoying fish sandwich. In the evening, the protagonist lay on her bed and thought she was very tired. But she was glad that, with the help of the servants, the rebuilding of the garden would be completed sooner than she had expected. The girl, to her surprise, had already completed the design of the entire garden. So now the main problem is the Duke, who does not want to show himself. She stood up, and afterward noticed that all of her hands were covered in small scratches. Hedel awkwardly picked up her hand and thought that it wasn't as bad as she expected. And then she went to bed. In the night, she woke up feeling very thirsty, and again the girl did not realize when she had managed to fall asleep. But then I heard and saw a silhouette moving around the room. She immediately jumped up and then realized that at this hour, no one but one man could have come to her. So looking at the man, she assumed it was the Duke, and decided to test her guess. Since Adele couldn't see anything, she wanted to reach for the candle, but then she remembered the moment when she had already asked to light it, and the Duke had said that for now, it couldn't be done. Then the girl looked at him and thought I shouldn't turn on the light. Looking at the tall man, she wondered why he had come to her. And afterwards, without any answer from him, she informed him that today she had signed the marriage contract, so that all that was left was for him to sign it, and from now on they would be married. The girl realized that now, wherever she found herself, instead of her name, she would be addressed as the Duchess of Eckerd, and even at the same time, she still did not see her husband's face. She remembered the rumors that had been circulating among the noblewomen that said he was truly hideous and monster-like. But the girl knew that even if he was as ugly as they said he was, she had made a vow to herself that she would accept him for whoever he was. So looking at him confidently, she asked if he could show himself before her. He clenched his fist and then informed me that it wasn't time yet. She shook with anger and thought that if he wouldn't even show his face, he wouldn't want to talk to her either. He's always hiding and not talking. He won't even arrange a wedding. So Hedel was very angry, and she got up and started moving towards him. Afterwards, she asked him confidently and emotionlessly why he came to her every night. She was angry that this is the man who asked her to marry him, and now she's acting so inappropriately. He asked her to stay back, but the girl approached anyway, his clear blue eyes almost snake-like in the dragon scales that adorned his face. The girl didn't realize if she was really seeing something like that, or if she was imagining it. The man was clearly very frightened by this sudden approach from the protagonist. He did not know how to behave, and how to hide such an inappropriate appearance. He looked very frightened. The protagonist was no less surprised, and did not realize whether what she saw was true or not. Hedel had absolutely no idea what she was seeing on his face right now. He abruptly turned around and walked away without explaining anything. She was still standing in the middle of the room, not realizing what she had seen. She turned around and saw the silver box lying on her desk. Looking at it, the girl realized that before on the table there was absolutely nothing, and then lifted the box and found that it was a medicinal ointment. It was morning, and the girl, still holding the scale she'd found, reasoned that the ointment he'd given her was something for treating wounds. But that didn't bother her much, because the really important thing was the Duke. She couldn't see everything well in the darkness, but she could see that his skin and neck were glistening, and there was something that looked like scales. At this time, she was looking at the same small scale and realized that she had found it after the Duke's first arrival. The girl didn't understand if Duke Eckert was really a real monster. But afterwards she decided that even if it were true, she would accept him no matter how monstrous he was. If he wasn't hurting anyone, she wouldn't care. And then she mentally ordered herself to calm down and not to jump to conclusions. After all, she and the Duke were now officially husband and wife. Hedel had just decided to go to the garden to unwind, but she saw that work was already in full swing. She asked the men what they were doing, and those smiling ones reported that his lordship had ordered them to help rearrange the garden, so all the hard work they would do themselves. The girl immediately realized that they were madly different from the other subordinates of the Duke, and looking at her scratched hand wondered if the Duke does not trust her, or perhaps he thinks that she will not be able to rebuild the garden. And afterward, pressing her hand firmly into a fist, she promised that she would show him what she was worth. Then turning to the men, Hedel smiled clearly, thanking them for their work. She was with them the whole time and told them what they should do and what they should do. Eventually, I passed some time. They even managed to plant some flowers, and a week later they had completely cleaned up the garden and planted all the flowers they had planned, as well as rebuilding the alley. Everything was done really conscientiously, so the protagonist had some free time remembering the bullying of the servants, which was repeated many times. Hedel decided that she had to take serious measures, so the protagonist lowered the wages of those servants who were engaged in bullying. Now she was sitting reading a book. The girl knew she couldn't sit on the Duke's neck. That's why she had to study local laws, customs, and learn etiquette, and learn more about everything in the East. But suddenly she noticed the duchy records Gilliam had given her. The Duke's coat of arms is a dragon with a pearl in its mouth. Hedel also knew that the dragon was a mystical creature, and for the Empire, it had sacred significance because its history was often linked to dragons. They had been in the tales of the Empire since its founding. When the discoverer first came to the frozen and fog-shrouded land and met the dragon there, the great dragon wanted to help people, and with one breath he melted all the ice. Thanks to the dragon, the once dead land was transformed into a fertile land, and people were able to build Burnia on it. The girl thought about this dragon legend. She realized that there were still rumors that Duke Eckert had dragon blood in his family, but no one had ever been able to prove it, because no one would believe such fairy tale rumors. The current Duke has never left the eastern lands, but everyone believes that he is a descendant of the dragon, so no one claims his land. After all, no one knows the truth, and no one wants to risk it. The girl decided to rest, and after extinguishing the candles sat. But then she heard some noises. Hedel decided to go to the door to open it and check, but suddenly she heard someone talking, and the others reassured each other that they had all been asleep for a long time, and therefore no one would hear them. The protagonist was shocked and put her hands over her mouth to keep her mouth shut. The people who had come began to plan what they were going to do to the girl at the beginning. She didn't know what to do. She thought it was safe enough, but now someone wanted to hurt her. She heard several voices chattering about how they should attack while she slept, and then they could have some good fun. The protagonist all blackened her mouth with her hand, in order not to emit any scream or loud breathing, began to hide. When the uninvited guests entered, they saw that her bed was empty. The disgruntled maid began to order everyone to look in her room, so that they could find her as soon as possible, because she could not hide far away. The girl was sitting trying not to breathe in the middle of her clothes and heard her name called, and these threatening men ordered her out, and then threatened to do things to her that Duke Monster had never even dreamed of. One man was looking at the room when suddenly a servant girl said that those who should not stand, but better check her storeroom in which, precisely, she was located. Ta watched through the small crack in the door, and her body trembled with fear. Hedel didn't know what to do. She realized that she couldn't scream because in any case, even if someone wanted to come, it would be too late, but suddenly she heard some sounds as if someone was beating others. Through the slits, she saw the Duke standing bent over in front of the men, and the maid got down on her knees and begged to be spared because she had made a huge mistake that would never happen again. She begged to be given just one chance. Then Hedel, who still couldn't see everything properly, thought it was surprisingly suddenly too quiet. She didn't realize what was happening, but suddenly the door to her storeroom was opened by Duke Eckert, a beautiful man who finally decided to show himself to her. He looked at Hedel and asked if she was all right. She looked closely at his face and asked if it was him. But Eckert took her hands and assured her that he was Cassian Eckert, and that she was safe now. Before the incident, he was washing in his room and was approached by the butler, who informed him that his body had returned to its former form, and then asked him if he was ready to meet the lady, for she had asked to see him again today. Butler added that, granted, he had told her that he was away on business, but if things continued like this, there might be a misunderstanding. Cassian then indicated that he was worried that she might already hate him. He felt very depressed thinking about it. Then the butler awkwardly reflected that perhaps he had raised the matter too soon and it should have been done later, for he was very sad to see his master so depressed. Then he turned to Cassian and told him that he should clarify his relationship with Hedel, because she was a good person and would accept him anyway, and if he continued to hesitate, he would definitely regret it. He agreed and afterward informed her that he would try to start a conversation with her. Hoping that Hedel hadn't seen him that very day, Gilliam then explained to Cassian that the lady was now a duchess and he advised him that he should pay more attention to managing the estate's budget. Butlers videoed the Duke's distressed face and realized that they had not met under very unpleasant circumstances, so the gentleman was a little upset and you really hoped that Hedel could little by little change it. Cassian got dressed and left the room. Taking his sword and looking at it carefully, he realized that he could not stay in this house for long, because soon he would have to go hunting, which was obligatory at his status. So putting on his cloak, he headed over to the main character and pondered if she was already asleep at this hour. He reflected that he wanted to meet her before he left. But suddenly at some point he heard the servants talking, and the phrase, "Come out with us, it will be more pleasant than with that ugly Duke," shocked him. He was as angry as he had ever been, and seemed ready to kill anyone who got in his way. But everything was fine now. Hedel stood beside him, frightened but unharmed. When the girl realized that he was her husband, she awkwardly backed up and began to lose her balance. But at that moment she was caught by Cassian Eckert. The protagonist did not understand why her heart began to beat so fast and why her hands were so warm in his embrace. She felt something was wrong with her, but she didn't realize what had changed. But suddenly at that moment the Duke let go of her, and when he was sure she was already standing steady enough, awkwardly apologized. He saw Hedel's hands shaking, and after covering her with his cloak, he apologized for not seeing it through and also warned, looking intently into her still worried face, that he had dealt with those people, but the picture that was now behind his back was better not for the girl to see. So he suggested that he carry her into the living room by himself and ask her to close her eyes. The girl agreed, and then in an instant she was in his strong arms. Against his backdrop, Hedel seemed absolutely weightless. The girl clung to him to keep from falling, wondering why her heart was beating so fast. She couldn't find the answer to that question. After a while they were already in the living room, and the girl, standing awkwardly in front of him, thanked him for saving her life. Then the young gentleman, awkwardly averting his eyes from her, informed her that he had a scheduled hunt tomorrow, so that he would soon have to leave Dot, and afterward reflected that her lodging room was now unfit, so he proposed that she should spend the night in his bedroom. The girl was very surprised at such a suggestion and shocked, not knowing what to answer. The girl awkwardly interjected, not understanding what the man meant. But then Cassian Eckert calmly explained that all the other rooms in the manor were occupied. The girl reflected that she didn't really believe there were no quiet chambers in such a large building, but still, it was a good chance to finally talk to him. Unlike ordinary people, married nobles stay overnight in the same room only for carnal pleasures, and therefore, the protagonist did not even know what awaits her in the future. It is better right now to show the Duke that she is completely on his side. Then he took her in his arms again and noticed that she had been walking barefoot all this time. She awkwardly admitted to herself that she had not been walking at all, because she was always in his arms, and afterward she wondered if her heart was about to jump out of her chest every time she was around Cassian. He finally put her down already on the very bed in his room. The girl immediately noticed that there was some very strange atmosphere between them, as if something was going to happen. but suddenly she was distracted by the address of Cashin, who called her by name, and after stroking her hair, said he wished her good night. After which the girl went away. She hadn't expected much from him, but to cut things off so abruptly. Hedel was unhappy that, after everything that had happened to her, he hadn't paid her even the slightest bit of attention, and it had turned out exactly as Gilliam had said. The girl didn't understand why this was happening, and she was worried that in the future nothing might change. Eventually, she woke up, and for some reason she was having a nightmare. She got up on the bed and looked out the window, but realized that it was a surprisingly dense fog outside the window today, and then remembered that this was the weather here all year long. Jenna was distracted from looking at the weather when she walked in and asked her how she'd slept and if she'd been okay. And afterwards the girl reported that she had been awakened early in the morning by a terrible thunderstorm, and there was still a thick fog because of the heavy downpour. Then Hidali reflected that she had not expected it to rain for so long at all. Then Jenny looked conspiratorially and embarrassedly at Hedel and said that she was very surprised to find the protagonist in the Duke's bedroom that morning. She was glad that he had finally visited her, but she grudgingly remarked that they had nothing, and then said that she was here because she just wanted to know what the Duke's bedroom was like. Suddenly, they were interrupted by Gilliam, who came into her room. Then Jenny informed her mistress that she would return to her work and left them alone. The butler informed her that the Duke had told him what had happened, and he had come to see how she was feeling. Hedel awkwardly admitted that everything that had happened had surprised her greatly. Then the butler bowed and said that those who had done it were eternally ashamed and disgraced, and that he did not understand how they could have done such a thing. And then he said that what had happened was very much his fault. The girl was very sad. She didn't know how to react. The butler said that thanks to Hedel, the garden had undergone a remarkable transformation, and then added that after the death of the Lord's parents, the garden had fallen into disrepair, but she was able to restore it to its former state. So from now on, they will strengthen the estate's security and replace all the old staff for her own safety, and then awkwardly asked the girl not to leave him. Tay was still reflecting on what had happened yesterday, and she admitted to herself that such an incident reminded her to never let her guard down. But then she smiled at the butler and said that she had no intention of leaving them. He thanked her for her kindness and said that later he would prepare another bedroom for her. Hedel reassured him, telling him that she didn't care where she slept, but she did care where the Duke slept. He smiled and said that he had been asleep in the living room the whole time, and then, to change the subject, said that Hedel had probably been very surprised by the situation outside the window. She looked around and remembered that she'd never seen a house this dense before, but the butler had said that this kind of weather was commonplace here. Then the girl conceived that through such a curtain she could hardly see the outlines of the garden, and perhaps it was because of this that no one was tending it. But was brought out of her musing by Gilliam, who inquired of the lady if she would like to eat. They ended up in the kitchen with the Duke. They sat at a very long 8-seat table at different edges of it. Then the girl awkwardly asked him how he felt and how well rested he was. Afterwards, she thanked him for lending her the bedroom for the night. Looking at the man sitting across from her, she saw his mysterious sapphire eyes and slightly pale skin. Hedel didn't understand why the mere sight of him made her heart jump. She was quite unaware of what was happening to her, but suddenly she was drawn from her gaze on the Duke by the cook, who informed her that she was ready tomorrow. The girl was horrified to see what she had brought. What lay there stank unbelievably. Looking at the dish, the girl did not understand why the sauce in it is such a strange pale green color, but despite this, the protagonist thought that it does not matter how the dish looks. After all, the main thing is what it tastes like. But when she tasted it, her face contorted. She found the food insanely unpalatable, but the protagonist tried to keep a low profile because all the time the Duke was looking at her intently, literally never averting his gaze, which made the protagonist feel a little uncomfortable. She couldn't understand what he was thinking. Was he trying to tease her or mock her or something? One day, when Cashin Eckert was still a small child, he went to the noise in his parents' room, but saw his mother and father lying in pools of their own blood and not breathing. For a little boy of that age, it was an absolute shock to lose his parents. As a child, he had lost the meaning of life and was ready to give up, but the curse took over and he had to become Duke Eckert himself. It was enough to break him. He remembered it while he was guarding the protagonist's door after her attack. He had stood by her all night until dawn, and he was very tired because of it. But of course, it was obvious that no one else ever dared to show up. He could not believe that his own men could do such a thing. But the butler told him that he himself had no idea that they were capable of it. But Cashin had convinced Gilliam that it was not his fault, for he had a primary task, and that was the running of the estate. And afterwards, he reflected that he had absolutely not expected the security of his estate to be so flimsy. And so he resolutely realized that with Hedel coming into his life and his home, he needed to change things drastically, and then told the butler that they had to deal with the estate staff first. The girl looked at the rain outside the window and sadly realized that she was going to take a walk today, but apparently her walk would not be successful. Afterward, she turned around and heard the conversation between the two maids, who were musing that it was very nice when the sun was shining and they had already forgotten what the nightmare mist was like here. Then the protagonist turned to them. Startled, the servants apologized for their chatter and said they would get to work right away. Then the girl explained that she had not come to scold them and warned them that the weather was very bad today, so if they wished, they could rest, but they assured her it was okay because they were used to it. Then the girl looked sadly at her feet and thought that she really wished this rain would stop. And at that moment the clouds parted and the drops began to fall less and less frequently, until the rain stopped completely and the sky was filled with sunshine. All this was observed by the protagonist, who carefully looked out the window. Then the maids were shocked to find that the rain really stopped and that the bright sun came out, and then turned to the mistress and wondered if she could change the weather. But there with embarrassment she remarked that it was just a lucky coincidence and she had no such properties. Then the maids, conversing amongst themselves, speculated that it was perhaps the curse of the lost dragon treasure had finally broken. The protagonist asked them what they meant and what legend they were talking about. She was told that there is a legend in these lands that says that the sun will light up the forgotten lands when the dragon of the east returns his treasure. But the protagonist assured that it was just a nice coincidence because she had walked here before, but nothing had changed. Then the protagonist said that since the weather had improved dramatically, she would like to go for a walk and asked the girls to prepare the carriage. After a while she was given a carriage and the protagonist was about to get in, but saw that Cashin was already sitting there, watching her carefully. The girl looked over his imposing figure and wondered what he was doing here. He said he had some things planned and this was the only wagon ready, so he would like to go along for the ride. The girl thought that it would be very awkward for them to go together and she didn't know how to behave, but anyway, they went on a trip together. The man had been scrutinizing her during the whole ride, and sometimes looked away in embarrassment, but suddenly the voice of the coachman, who informed the two that they had already arrived, knocked her out of her thoughts. And then the Duke helped Hedel out of the carriage and stopped beside her, waiting to see where she would go together. Then the girl looked in surprise at his cold and emotionless face, but at the same time no less attractive. She asked, "Doesn't he have anything to do today?" But the latter calmly informed him that he had some time to spend with his wife, and before they left he warned Gilliam that he would see her off in person. The girl walked around town and looked around. There were really few people, and a lot of people took long weekends because of the sun. The girl was angry that everyone had gone on vacation because of the clear weather, but she realized that in these parts such a thing was really extremely rare. She took it with understanding, but she was still worried that all the stores would be closed. But suddenly the protagonist noticed a seed store. Then she hesitantly stepped inside and was met by a rather imposing figure of a man who inquired why she had arrived. She smiled and told him that she wanted to buy seeds from him, and he was happy to have a new customer. Then, in a conversation with the main character, the man confessed that when the sun shone a little, people were immediately interested in flowers, although only yesterday it had rained. And then the man asked what kind of seeds the lady was looking for. She smiled brightly at him and said that she would like to see all the seeds that he sells. The Duke stood silent all this time and watched his wife looking at all kinds of different seeds. And afterwards, she came up with a man who showed her the different varieties and also the fertilizers which had been brought from the capital. Hedel reflected that apparently because of the climate there was little demand for seeds, and that's why they cost so much more than those in the capital, and she also realized that she should pick flowers that would be perfect for their garden. But suddenly, unexpectedly for the two of them, a sack of money fell on the table, and the Duke, looking the man over carefully, inquired how much. The salesman didn't know what he meant. Then the Duke fenced him off, rewarding him with a cold stare and asking him how much his store was worth. And after looking carefully at the man, he informed him that he would pay any price the man named, but the protagonist didn't understand this decision on the Duke's part, so she hesitantly asked why Cashin would buy the whole store outright. But he calmly replied to the protagonist that if he bought the whole store, the girl wouldn't have to choose one thing. She realized in shock that apparently that was the thinking logic of rich people like him. But afterwards she looked at him confidently, but still with a little surprise, and told him that he should not do it, as she did not want to influence his actions because of her desires. But Cashin informed her that he understood her excitement, but she could spend his money as she wished, for she had every right to meddle in all his affairs. Then the girl warned him that if he bought the whole store, it would cost him a huge amount of money. But the man scrutinizing the girl said he was perfectly fine with it and was willing to do anything to make the choice easier for Hedel. Then the girl looked away from her spouse and thought that if she thought more logically, the other side of his money could be spent on making a deal with the man's store to supply seeds at a lower price, and afterward she turned to the store owner and said that she thought it was a pretty good idea, as they would become his regular wholesale customers and he, in turn, would sell them seeds at a cheaper price. Then the man wondered how many seeds she planned to buy. The girl looked at him carefully and said that she would like to buy 10 species to start with. Hearing this, the man was a little shocked and asked if they really need so many, but the protagonist replied that recently the weather is very good and she wants to plant a lot of plants. The seller agreed with her and said that when they bloom, they will become very beautiful. It ended up taking them some more time to draw up the contract, but everything was ready. The girl was happy that now she could buy seeds profitably, and afterwards she said that she counted on this man very much. But suddenly they were brought out of their conversation by a scolding in the street. They immediately looked away, and the Duke covered the girl with his arm to protect her. The salesman went out to deal with the man who came in. Then the girl tried to ask the man if his seeds should be kept dry, but he seemed to be busy with other things. While he was fighting with one man, other people came up to him and told him that they shouldn't be fighting in such nice weather, but the male vendor told them to go to work instead of drinking. They had clearly had too much to drink. The Duke and the protagonist were watching the whole thing. They were both in a kind of awkward shock. Then, when they had withdrawn, the girl wondered what had happened at all, but the Duke reassured her and informed her that in the East people often behave like that. The girl asked him if he had time to go to the bookstore with her. Cashin replied that he didn't mind at all and was even glad to have the day off. The girl glowed when she heard this, because earlier she had noticed that he didn't seem to like their walks together at all, but he still continued to walk very patiently with her. But suddenly they were brought out of their musings by a shout, to which even the Duke himself took notice. Some man stood on the edge of the bridge and shouted that right now he was going into the river because he was a fish man. Other people approached him in order to take him off the edge, but he still kept swearing to you to let him go and let him become one with the mother water. The Duke was not happy to see this and seemed to be very sad at what he saw. The girl thought that her brother had once warned her that in the East many people suffered from depression because of the perpetual bad weather, and crime was high because of the very weak guards, but she did not think that things were so bad here. The Duke, turning to her, apologized for the sight he had seen. And the men were discussing the fact that, logically speaking, nothing good could be expected from the Duke. And some of them were saying that the fact that their duchy was ruled by the monster gave them goosebumps. All this time Cashin was sitting absolutely emotionless, not expressing any emotion, while the men were discussing the fact that they would very much like to see the Duke at least once to be convinced of his ugliness. The protagonist sat opposite him and realized that her husband heard every word, but he did not respond in any way. At this time he acted as if the story was not about him. He sat silently, lowering his eyes, while all three continued to discuss that they very much hope that they will never encounter this Duke. And afterwards they began to discuss the fact that he had recently married, and rumor had it that his wife was the lady from the capital. But the men didn't understand at all why she would marry a duke from the East. And afterwards they began to assume that if she had agreed to marry a monster, then her family must have been very poor and, apparently, so impoverished that they sold their daughter, because no rich family would not allow her to go so far away. The main character, who had previously tried to keep cool, was indignant and decided that she was not going to listen to this slander and terrible rumors, so she resolutely rose. She told the Cashin that she wanted to go home as soon as possible because she didn't want to be here anymore, and then she looked angrily at the men who had been talking badly. And what is the problem, Dot? When they were already quietly riding in a carriage, returning home, the girl apologized for acting a little rude. But the Duke calmed her down, saying that he understands everything, as he is used to such an attitude. The girl exhaled with relief, glad that the Duke understood her reaction, and thought that it was very good that they left so quickly. The protagonist, looking at her husband, thought that, initially, he did not really want to discuss what had happened, but now they are a little closer. The Duke awkwardly announced that he had bought something for her, and pulled out a cloth-wrapped candlestick and held it out to the girl. The Duke said that he had bought it at a store near the bookstore when they had stopped in the morning. And then he added that it seemed to him that in an extreme case it could serve as a good alternative to a weapon so that she could defend herself. The girl looked into his face and thanked him for such care about her. When the protagonist found herself alone in her room, she looked at her gift and could not think of a place for it to choose. Everywhere it looked somehow wrong and as if it did not fit the interior. But afterwards she calmed down, as it was not a decoration, so it should stay nearby. After all that happened, Hadel decided to sit down in order to write a letter to her family. It began with the protagonist asking her relatives how they were eating and whether they were doing well as a lot of questions about whether her cousin had come and whether everything was okay during this time. The last thing she said was that she would find a way to pay her debts as soon as possible. But at some point in the writing, the girl noticed that she was starting to fall asleep and decided to lie down on the table for a while to rest. And then, late at night, the Duke came into her room as a matter of habit, and scrutinizing her, leaned over her and passed his strong hand over her head, stroking her hair. He told the sleeping girl that he did not understand how to behave with her, because he was insanely afraid of hurting her and did not understand how to make her happy. But in one thing his confidence was unshakable, and that was that his heart belonged only to her.